Hey everybody, thanks again for joining me this week. So, this week we're going to continue talking about world building. And for those of you that missed last week, we're going to try and kind of keep talking about the theory of how to build worlds. And that is really applicable to game design and game development, but really we're talking about it in the bigger scope of things, in that this could really be applicable if you're a writer, if you're a storyteller of any kind, if you write movies or create movies, TV shows, or anything else. This is a much more broadly applicable set of skills that can be used in a lot of different places. And so don't think of this, today as being only applicable into to games, right? And we'll try our hardest to try to make these, applicable and make them understood. And how is this applicable into, if you're an artist or a writer or a designer or any kind of other jobs? Because world building really, for most people and most projects, is really a team effort. World building is incredibly hard. It's incredibly big, and it takes up, a tremendous amount of time. And when we're talking again about world building, to kind of recap from last week, we're really talking about how to build a franchise, right? How do we build something that's bigger than just a product? And I think that's the problem with world building, is that, especially in games, our time is quite often very short. Our time that we have to make things, i.e. the development time of how much time we have to design and things like that, is often very short. And so because of that, we're often not given the time to actually design properly. Meaning we're often just like, hey, we got to have all these things done and designed, in a very short period of time. And so we don't often have time to do what I would call true world building, because that usually takes a lot more time to go and really figure out what the universe is, what the big, what everything is going to be. And also, we're also going to be, looking at, how does a franchise differ, and how are franchises different than, say, starting from scratch and having, nothing to start with. And so there's a bunch of things there that also will kind of directly impact, your ideation. So, Rizwan Nation, if I say that right, how's it going? And looks like East Softball is a spam user. Okay. Interesting that people are figuring out how to spam Twitch. So seems like they're sending messages to a variety of Twitch channels or Twitch users. Very sad. So again, if you missed, hey Rushback, how's it going? Welcome back. So again, if you missed last week's talk, I definitely advise you to kind of go back and check it out. This week's might be a little disjointed, if you didn't see last week's, just because we are going to continue. Last week I actually had created 20 slides and we only went through 10. And so, hopefully in today's talk, we'll only get through those extra 10, and all that. And then, to give you guys a little bit of a heads up, of where this is going, because I think it's important to understand how this is all fitting together. In the weeks to come, actually, I think next week we might do a playthrough of Cyberpunk. So we might take a little bit of break from this just because such a big game's coming out, and it's so, I think, important to the game design world. So I think the intention will be next week to do a playthrough of Cyberpunk and talk through that. So just FYI, and then we're going to have 2 weeks off actually for the Christmas holiday. But starting back in January, we're going to keep going with this idea of world building. And what we're going to be doing is then going from just the overall concept of world building, and we're going to deep dive into kind of gameplay and spend a couple weeks on understanding how do you take gameplay and game design and world building and kind of mash them together. How do you make something cohesive, where you have to make the world and the gameplay all work work together. And Mohammed, for the previous slides, let me see if I can just send a link here. You can see if you're able to access that. I will go through the slides really quick, just so at least you have them, you can see them, and then if you're watching the recording from last week's, you can also go back and look at the previous last week's slides, paused if you need to. The Blasphemer, how's it going? Also feels good. So again, we're going to continue on with kind of world building, and then we're going to get into gameplay and world building, and then we're going to get into storytelling and world building. And then, so that's going to be probably over January-ish. And then we're going to get into actually building a game together. And we're actually going to sit down and apply the principles of world building and game design. And we're going to all sit down and pretty much go from a blank slate, and you're going to get to see how I design a game literally from nothing and make something out of it. And then hopefully you guys can help. And we're going to build it together and try to build up a game idea and create like a pitch deck and a design document and some stuff like that from scratch. Because I want you guys to kind of see again, how do these things really work, right? And how does this stuff, how's it really done? And that's, I think, the hard part is it's very easy, whether you're one of my students or whether you're just getting into game design or world building or any of this stuff, whether you're a writer, it's really easy to look at the theory and we look at a lot of these things and we go like, oh, this would seem, just making sure, can you guys hear me okay too? Is the audio all right? Hopefully you're, catching all that. Sorry guys, I don't know why okay, good. I don't know why that Google document's not working, but let me go through the slides, here and try to show you stuff. So anyways, so where I'm going with that is, again, in world building especially, it's really easy. And I think just game design in general, it's really easy to be like, oh yeah, well, it's easy to like come up with a game idea, right? Or to come up with a new world. And it's very easy for us to just say like, oh, I'm going to create the next Halo, or I'm going to go create the next, Cyberpunk, or whatever that world, that universe is. And, and in theory, you could say like, well, I've played a million games, I've done a million things, and like, so how hard can it be? And I think that a lot of my students and other game designers will attest that until you've done it a lot, until you've done things a lot, it's really challenging because you're like, oh, well, it seems like it's really easy, right? It seems like it's going to be super simple just to like come up with a game idea and then write it down and create a game pitch. And the reality is that it's usually 10 times harder than people think. The actual implementation of when you actually sit down and you try to put on paper your idea and you try to actually make something that works and make something that's fun, make something that's interesting, like all those kinds of things are much harder than people realize. And so today with world building, we're going to try to, again, spend a little extra time and really try to help you guys understand, how do I actually make these things? How do I actually like do these things, right? And I think that's an important distinction, because it's really easy to talk about the theory of world building. And also just to remind you guys, like, this is such a big topic. Like I could teach probably an entire year's course just on this talk, right? And just on this topic. So don't feel like that you're not getting it, or don't feel like, that it's there. I mean, this is an incredibly huge topic. This is not something that we're going to cover in just a couple weeks and that you're going to get. A lot of this is just going to come through you practicing and trial and error and kind of knowing where to start, how to get started, and that kind of thing, right? And so don't feel overwhelmed, because we're going to throw out kind of a lot of topics and a lot of things, and it really is hard to connect all the dots. And this is a skill set that I developed, over the course of 10, 20 years, not something that I just picked up and learned overnight, right? And so So don't be discouraged if this feels incredibly hard, right? Don't feel discouraged if this is something that's going to scare you away from being in game design or something, because this is definitely a little bit of a scary topic. So let me rehash very quickly. Hang in there, those of you that were here last week, Megan and others. Bear with me. Let me just kind of, for Muhammad and those that couldn't access the slide decks, which I'm not sure, again, why. That should have given you guys access, but I apologize. Let's go on here. So we first, last week, talked about how to get started. Where's that starting point of how and where do you generate ideas? Where do ideas come from? And where do you look for ideas? And, how do you get started, right? And that's a big problem, and something that we have to really we might start with an IP that's pre-existing, like Star Wars or whatever, but you might also have a completely new and fresh idea, and both are kind of, I guess, equally hard. And so that's something you have to sort of again be aware of, right? All right. Oh, this is my. I was seeing a thing here, and my laptop was in the way. I was like, what was that there? So apologize for that. I just saw a weird line and was trying to figure out what it was, and I had a laptop sitting open by my camera. All right. And then next we talked about researching ideas. Like, how do you go out and, and where do you research ideas, and how do you Google stuff, and talk about, where kind of do the ideas come from? And we talked about rules for your universe, like how do you create these rules, and what are the rules in your game, in your world, and why are rules important? And again, this is good rehash for those of you that even heard this last week, right? Because again, rules, even though they're meant to be broken, as we say, rules are still really important. And we have to understand that rules are something that allows a player or a viewer, again, they could be a reader or it could be somebody watching it, somebody playing it, right? But if you start breaking rules, and if you set certain conventions and people expect that convention to exist, and that convention no longer exists, then they get confused, right? So the example I kind of used last week was might have a dragon, and if we have a traditional fantasy world and we've established everything as being very Tolkien-esque, D&D style, fantasy, even though there's slight variations in that as a world or universe and IP, if we, suddenly, dressed up a dragon in a pink tutu dress and had it dancing around, and was our best friend, people might be like, what in the heck? What? That doesn't fit the universe. It doesn't fit the world. It doesn't fit the rules that I expected that world to follow. And so why is that? And it doesn't mean you can't do that, but you need to explain it, right? And something you have to understand why rules are really important in your universe. Now, rules are kind of, part of logic, right? And so this is something that you have to kind of understand, and that the rules and the logic, in these things are, really important, right? And so again, these are kind of linked hand in hand, and knowing, why is logic needed in a universe, right? Why does a player or person need to understand that? Why does understanding something logically help them, right? Well, it's a lot less for people to process. And, I don't know if I mentioned this in my talk last week, but for example, at some of the companies I've been at, we did studies about things like why at the time fantasy was much more popular than science fiction. And this was true across a lot of genres, both in movies, books, and games for a very long time. And I don't know statistically if that's the same. I would suggest or think that might have shifted a little bit in some regards, and that it seems like there's been more sci-fi recently, at least. But that being said, back when we did these studies, we understood that science fiction was harder for people to understand, because they didn't have consistent rules across the different brands, IPs, things like that. So the sci-fi world that you would find in one movie or one book or one game, if you take the world of Halo or Star Wars and compare it to the worlds of Aliens and Predator, right? Those are two very different universes with very different rules in them. And so you don't necessarily know, like in the Star Wars universe, an alien could be good or bad. And, or somewhere in between. Whereas in like the Aliens universe, the aliens themselves are, super vicious, bad creatures. The Predators are kind of more bad, but still they get portrayed as a little bit gray area in that they're kind of just doing a job. And it is who they are. They're not necessarily, I'll use the word evil for lack of a better definition of what a alien is, like from the Aliens movies. Those things are just pure evil in the sense that they just want to eat you. Whereas the Predator was like, oh, okay, you're not armed. We're hunters. So we're kind of in that weird, almost like a bounty hunter. Like we're in this gray area of like, we're not necessarily out trying to conquer the universe. We're not trying to take over your planet. We're just doing what we do, and there's a gray area kind of around that. Rosemation, I don't know about, I can't show YouTube videos on here. If I don't know what it is, you're welcome to DM it to me and, I'll take a look at it and see it, but I can't show it, on this channel. So, you're welcome to, again, send it to me privately and I'll take a look at it, but, I apologize. I can't show it on here. So I have to control my, what people are seeing here. So, but please feel free to send it to me privately. And the next is getting into something that is, unique, right? And how do we create worlds that are unique, right? And I think that's something that, is much harder than we realize because it's really easy to either make something like really crazy, super unique or something that's like slightly unique, Roswell Nation, I'm not sure if you can send it in the chat. You can send it to my I'll send you my sorry. There's my my email. You can send it to me there. Anyways, so when you're creating a new universe, a new world, a new IP, that is, it's a very delicate balance to find the balance between creating something new and creating something, interesting, but still something that, again, people understand and recognize. And this comes back to rules, right? And understanding what rules are you following for this universe, right? And not getting too crazy with it. And then we talked about like existing IPs and like how do you start with something like Star Wars, and how do you deal with that versus something that's new and completely original that's great from your from the start, right? That's all of your own ideas. And then we got into kind of backstory and history, meaning, at some point, not necessarily day one, but every universe, every world typically has a set of histories, backstories, mythologies. Those could be events in the world. They could be characters, locations, and those locations may or may not even still exist, right? They could be a location like Atlantis that is more mythological and doesn't exist anymore. They could be, in the Star Wars universe, a planet that got destroyed, right? Or something like that. And so in one hand, in your current history and the current stuff of what the game needs to know or the world and universe need to know, that thing may or may not be relevant, right? But it might have some relevance to the fact that there might be eventually some people that you meet, and maybe they're from that location. Think of the movie like Aquaman, right? Where, Aquaman is his backstory is as an Atlantean, and he comes into a kind of our modern everyday world and then, and it exists in that, right? And so I think that's something that's important for you to understand that sometimes backstory and history can be important because that may set up the whole story, right? That may have a critical thing. That may be the backstory and history for why some conflict exists. Like, maybe, a bad guy destroys a planet or destroys a town or destroys somebody's home or whatever that is, or they killed their lover, or they did whatever it is. They did something bad, and that history ultimately creates the current circumstances and gives, some justification for why the player is doing what he's doing, right? And that can be, really important. Next is talking about the technology. And we talked about this kind of briefly last week. And what we're talking about here is not the technology of like what rendering engine you're using or the technology for, your game that you're making or whatever, right? This is not how you're programming the game. This is not what we're talking about, like modern day technology, right? Here, we're talking about what is the technology level for your world, right? And are they super advanced? Are they ancient, and only have, stone knives and, and really basic weapons, or do they have lasers and, anti-gravity drives and, super high technology level beyond what we even have today, right? And so defining the technology and maybe it could be a single unified technology level throughout your entire world and universe. But it also could be multiple technology levels. And I used the reference last week about Stargate, SG-1, but the same would go for Star Wars, Star Trek. Most giant kind of epic, IPs that travel the universe and go to multiple places generally have the ability to, they generally encounter different aliens or different races or different things, people, whatever that is, that are often at different technology levels, right? And that's part of what kind of makes it interesting for a lot of those big, giant, massive worlds. The space opera type stuff is that they go to places and then have to deal with stuff that maybe is more advanced in technology or less advanced in technology, or maybe is, more fantastical, and things like that. And so magic, there's that ancient saying of, anything that's, not drawing a blank on it, that's, sufficiently advanced technology is seen as magical, right? And so, I mean, even if we took cell phones back, if they worked, obviously they wouldn't, back 1,000 years or whatever, right? But a lot of our computers and our technology and the things that we could do, today is, a lot of the stuff that we can do in today's world is would be seen as very magical to somebody 1,000 years ago, right? And so that's the kind of stuff that you have to sort of be aware of, right? Excuse me. Now, so to dive a little bit deeper on that, I think that again, technology and magic are very closely linked. And whether you're using, magic systems in the traditional kind of D&D style magic and mana and how that works, whether it's in like Lord of the Rings where, elves have, some forms of magic and some other groups kind of have magic. But for example, humans don't have magic, right? So technology and magic can be intermixed, and magic does not have to be something that everybody has. Magic could be imbued abilities within people. It could be a substance that people take or something like that. I created a world, a universe with a friend of mine, Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo, some years ago that we created a game and a movie based on and called Steam. And in that IP, in that universe, the way that you got magic was you actually inhaled this substance, this steam, and that steam would then give you magical abilities. And that presented a kind of a unique scenario in that it didn't matter who had it. So controlling that substance became what was most important. And it wasn't that you're an elf or that you're an orc or that you're human or whatever. It wasn't based on your race, but it was just based on the substance and stuff. And so it became this very, very, very powerful thing that everybody wanted to fight over. And so that was a very different paradigm than the traditional innate ability or magic or whatever you want to call it that is common in a lot of things. Now, in some cases, sometimes magic and technology are again very closely linked. If you think about Star Wars and the Force, right, and the Force is actually initially, if you watch episodes 4, 5, and 6, the Force is kind of portrayed as magical. It's sort of like the Jedis have it, and some people inherently have it. It's part of the universe, it's part of the world, and they don't really explain it. And so it really comes across as this limited ability that isn't necessarily race specific or whatever. It's just for some random reason, some people have it, some people don't. Some people can control it, some people can't, but it's still a pretty rare, pretty unique thing, right? And I personally liked the fact that it was sort of magical in the sense we didn't know much about it. It existed, but it wasn't clear how or why. But then if you watched episodes 1, 2, and 3, unfortunately George decided to explain the Force, and he created a thing called metachlorians, and then he explained how metachlorians got into your system and all these kinds of things. And so he used technology to explain what the magic was. And then in some regards, he lost the magic, in my opinion, because suddenly you're trying to explain something that was magical. And it was, to me, more special as magic and kind of its unknown, its uncertainty and what it was. And I appreciated that more than sort of knowing that there was some weird metachlorians and your metachlorian count wasn't high enough to be a Jedi. And like, I didn't find that very fascinating. I didn't find that explanation of it good. And so what I'm trying to talk about here is that when you're creating your universe, mystery can be good, right? You don't have to explain everything, but people need to know the rules, right? How do I become a Jedi? How do I get that magic? How do I get that special ability? And yeah, also, I don't think it did get mentioned after episode 1, but yeah, I think you agree with me. That was just like a horrible WTF of like, why did you just explain that thing? So I don't know. I'm a hardcore Star Wars fan, as you can tell again by my Boba Fett statues and all my other Star Wars stuff around my office. But yeah, that was one of those things as a fanboy that just totally like frustrated me. So anyways, but again, it comes back to rules, right? It comes back to like, okay, what are the rules in this universe? How does magic work? And what's also, let me pause here for a second. So as a world builder, I also want you guys to understand that there's two types of information, right? So what you really want to know, and what you as the designer for now, and I'll encapsulate that to say your design team, right? Your production team, the people that are involved in your project. There is information that you need to know that's for your eyes only, right? There is going to be things like maybe midichlorians that maybe you define. Maybe you do, when you're doing your world building, maybe you actually do define those things, right? Maybe you do say that, these 100 races exist and we have all this kind of stuff, right? And the world can be a very, very big place. But that does not mean that you have to explain it all. It does not mean you have to tell it all. It does not mean you have to show it all, right? And maybe it's slowly revealed over dozens of products. Maybe it exists to give you, explanations for things down the road, or whatever the case is. Or maybe it's just there for you to understand it, so that you can explain it and give a bit of a mystery to it and slowly reveal it and stuff like that, right? But in that same way that the Force is kind of mysterious, right? And they tried to explain it away, it wasn't necessary to do. And so don't feel that everything has to be explained, but it needs to be explained well enough that your viewer is going to accept it and believe in it and be interested in it, in those kinds of things, right? But keep in mind that, again, your world Bible, for lack of a better definition, that world Bible that you're going to create that has everything in it about your universe can be very unique to yourselves, right? That can be something that is just for your eyes only, right? And that may or may not ever get released to the public. That may or may not ever see the light of day, but that can be really important for the long-term, construction of your universe, to make sure that everything is consistent, and that kind of thing, right? Because one of the problems we have, and the reason why we create these world Bibles and stuff, is that consistency is really important, right? And so it's very easy again to like create something, write something, do something that suddenly makes no sense, right? And then suddenly you're like, oh wait, that didn't work, right? And we never thought about that, and that's still going to happen no matter how well we plan, no matter how much we plan, those kind of things. That stuff still is going to happen to us, but we want to try to minimize that, right? So so technology and magic. I mean, I think it's you need to understand in your universe, in both cases, what I like to do is kind of abstract out what are these things used for, right? In my world, in my universe, why do these things, I'm just calling them things for now. So whether it's an object, it's a technology, it's magic, what is it, right? Is it an object, first of all, right? Is it something, right? So is it, my lightsaber, or is it my inherent ability of the Force, like my magical ability? So a lot of things could be inherent abilities. They could also be a technology or a feature that's there. I could have a bionic implant so that my arm is super strong or something like that, right? That's technology that's driving, something, that's there, right? But it becomes almost an innate inherent ability. So things like that may cross both boundaries, but what you're trying to do is kind of understand from a mile high view, what problem are you trying to solve, right? What is this thing there to do? And so again, it's good to understand, like, why are you trying to invent this thing? Is it just to make the world more interesting and more, useful? Or is this thing serving a purpose, right? So for example, a spaceship is going to get you from, is a potential thing to get you from a start to a finish, that you're going to do, that you're going to have, as a thing for transportation, right? And a starship is no different in a sci-fi world than a horse would be in a Western, right? It gets me from one town to the next town, and maybe that's its only purpose, right? Now, maybe a starship, X-Wing fighter or the Millennium Falcon or whatever, even though the Millennium Falcon didn't get in a lot of scraps, it was really its guns were defensive for the most part. They didn't really go in and do a whole lot of offensive stuff. Although I guess you could argue in the end of episode 4, he does use it to take out Darth Vader. But it's not like they get into big, massive battles with the Millennium Falcon versus an X-Wing fighter that's going into and actually starting to fight, as a fighter or as a bomber, right? And so I'm saying that here in those cases, Luke Skywalker uses his X-Wing to travel from planet to planet. So it's a device for transportation, but it's also something he takes into battle and he fights with, right? And so in the same way, a tank might be something that you might drive from point A to point B. It's probably not the best choice of travel, but it can be done. But it also is there to fight with, right? And so, but what I want you guys to, again, think up higher level for is how, when I'm building these worlds, what are the categories of things that I'm trying to define? What are these things and what are the purposes that these things are doing in my story, in my game, in my movie, right? Like, is this technology that helps heal me, and that's solving a purpose there? Is this, magic that helps heal me, right? I could have, an inherent ability. So I could have, for example, a technology device, that, is used to scan somebody or it injects them or does something and it heals them, right? I could have, magic that me as a magician healer, I can put my hand on you or whatever, and I can cast a healing spell, and that thing, heals you, right? And so that's magic that's healing me versus technology, and an item that's healing me, versus, maybe there's even like a doctor skill, so not only is it just, it might be that I have to have an item, maybe it's not technology, but I need a skill, a medical skill or something like that also allows me to do the healing, right? So the point is looking at things by, like, why do they exist and what are they trying to solve in that world? And then by creating these buckets, you can then look at is there a technology solution? Is there a magic solution? Is there another solution? Is it something inherent in the world? I mean, there could be pools, of this special water in the world. And if I walk into it, it heals me, right? So that's nothing to do that, is that magic or is it technology? Maybe we don't know. Maybe it doesn't matter. do we have to explain how I heal when I walk into this water, right? It just is that I walk into the water and I heal. It could be God. It could be whatever we want it to be, right? And maybe we explain it and maybe we don't, right? But I'm trying to show is that what you're doing first and foremost is you're identifying, while you're world building, you're identifying needs. You're identifying what do I need to have in my world to facilitate my stories, my quests, my adventures, my heroes, my characters, and a lot of that stuff. And you're trying to figure out how to put that in the world, and then have these things there for a variety of reasons. And then next week, we'll get into a little bit more of why this healing story is important when we get into next week's talk and talk about the gameplay side of that, because then we'll dive in a little bit more of like, well, why do we need healing? And then like, how do we control healing, right? And how do we do that? And how does that world help us do that, right? If we have to eat food and we can only find food in certain places, then the inherent world, the design of the world, the level design, and that have to fit with the story, and stuff. So this has nothing to do with even the technology and magic. This is the world. So the world might have a tree that grows food on it, and that's the food I need that, makes me, heal or makes me, do better. So from a gameplay, game design perspective, those trees are really important. And then in the world building side, you're like, okay, but trees can't grow everywhere because we need to, that just doesn't make sense in our world. And so, so now, and the game designer's like, well, we need X number of trees, or we need this fruit, or we need this thing, and you're kind of going back and forth because, the world might want to have a forest of these trees over here and maybe a few of them over here in the city that somebody's growing, and it makes sense in the world for where you can find those trees. And so the world builder goes, hey, that's what I need. That's what makes sense in my world, and that's what makes logical sense. That's what follows the rules. And so in the world builder's mind, that might be perfectly acceptable, right? And that can be totally true. But in the same hand, the game designer then steps in and goes, hey, wait a second, like that doesn't work for me because I need to have trees every, 500 meters so that the player can heal or whatever, right? And so like, how do you overcome that? And that's what we'll get into, later, but I just want you to see how, again, you're identifying a need, and that need, for example, in this is that there's something in the world that, that makes these worlds, interesting and stuff. And so whether I'm using technology or magic or the world or innate abilities, these are all things that are all really tightly interwrapped. And so that's why when you're thinking about technology and magic, you have to really be thinking about, how do these things exist in the world? How are these things powered? How are these things used in the world? Is magic just free and unlimited? Like if I'm an elf and I have magic, can I just cast magic all day long and I just have an unlimited amount of it? Or does it drain me and make me tired? And, I'm just going to be like, well, okay, not that I want to ruin The Mandalorian, but if you guys are watching The Mandalorian and watch how he's using the Force recently, and you'll see how tired it makes him. So, using magic or the Force can make you very sleepy. And so, but that's a limiter, right? That's something we'll talk about next week or in the weeks to come when we talk about gameplay in the world, but limiters are needed. But that becomes inherent in the nature of your world building, right? And so if your world building doesn't have, if your world building doesn't have, again, these ties together with the gameplay, it gets difficult, right? So I'm trying to give you guys inherent examples so you kind of can understand this, and trying to not blow through this too fast because it is challenging, right? And I want you to kind of understand that, like how we kind of put these things together and how we're kind of thinking about these things as systems and stuff. Because again, the systemic design of world building is not too different from the way we would design the gameplay systems in a game, but they're all like really tightly related, right? And you can't necessarily easily design one without the other. And then, again, like how does something get powered, is another part of that thing that I won't go deep into here, but technology and magic both usually need to have some limits and need to have some finite, stuff. And then that technology through those limits, can change the universe, in a dramatic way. And so, for example, if you guys are watching Star Trek Discovery, I've been watching. I'm a big Star Trek fan as well. Sorry, I'm a big geek. And anything sci-fi to me is great. And so I've been watching Star Trek Discovery. And if you haven't watched it, it's amazing. They actually have done a really good job. Not perfect, but I do love it. And in the latest season, dilithium, if you guys know, which basically powers all of the Star Trek Starship Enterprise, all the vehicles, the starships, their interstellar capabilities, their warp drives are all powered off of a substance called dilithium. And I don't want to ruin it too much if you haven't seen it, but basically, in short, all the dilithium in the universe, or most of it, gets destroyed. And so basically, now in the current, Star Trek world, they can't really do warp speed and can't really get around the world, can't get around the universe very fast. And so the universe has changed in a dramatic way. And so their backstory, if you've seen any other Star Trek show or any other Star Trek things, right? They're warping around the universe and they're doing this, and all these thousands of planets are all working together. And it's kind of like, the distances and times and stuff have been shortened a lot because dilithium allowed them through technology to use warp drives and basically, go places really quickly. And take that ability away, and suddenly now the whole world changes, right? And so it's a very great case study to show how that one piece of technology, that one piece that enabled transportation, again, transportation is a big bucket, right? Like, transportation controls a lot of our world. And I don't want to underestimate that, because whether you're taking a horse, whether you're walking, whether you're flying or whatever that is, right? Every world is going to change dramatically if transportation shifts. Right? The faster and easier that transportation, messaging, information, and things like that happen, the smaller the universe sort of gets, right? So like right now, if you took even our world and went back 100 years ago when, when jet airplanes and things weren't prevalent or didn't even exist. I mean, we were just 100 years ago, we're just beginning to fly, right? And so like, in order to get from, America to England, we had to take a ship, and that took a long time. And that was like months of travel. And then suddenly that decreased down to hours, right? And then we get supersonic jets now, and that gets down to a couple hours, and then suddenly if we could teleport, that could be instantaneous. How does the world change, right? And then suddenly now we create spaceships that can, go to Mars. Right now it would take us, I forget, they said it's 8 months or something at current technology to get to Mars. Well, at some point, probably not in my lifetime, but at some point, that's going to get down to hours or get down to days, right? How does the world shift when suddenly we can go to Mars in a few hours, right? So transportation can be a big part of our worlds because it makes our world shift and change dynamically based on how easy the different groups and factions and things can work together and have information and share and trade and all these kinds of things. So don't underestimate when I'm talking about transportation as a bucket about how important that is, because in a world building sense, that really can dramatically shift your world in a significant way. And so yeah, you just need to determine all of these different gadgets and things and what are they being used for. And again, abstract it out into concepts, abstract it out into ideas. And so that you understand, like, I need weapons, I need armor, I need defenses, I need technologies for living. Like, I might need technologies for around food and farming and things like that, right? And every world, every universe might have a slightly different set of needs. For example, if you were on a planet that was very, had dangerous gas, that the entire atmosphere was unbreathable. If we were going to go to Saturn or some planet that, we couldn't breathe the atmosphere right now as human beings, we would need, a mask to survive, or we might need something that keeps us warm because because it's too cold. And, right now, yes, we have some of that technology. Even in our current tech levels, that stuff exists. But does it exist well enough that we'd want to live there? And could we really work there? Could we do things there? And stuff. And so you might have whole technologies around, a universe or a world. And that is can be a scary thing of how do you adapt to that, right? How do you know what you're taking into this hostile situation, and what are you supposed to do with that, right? Now, as a side note, for those of you that like to read, and I don't know if you can still find it. I'm sure, I haven't looked recently to see if it's on, I'm sure it's digitally somewhere, but one of my favorite books as a kid was by Robert Heinlein, called Tunnel in the Sky. Let me write this in here. And if you guys aren't familiar with it, it's very, it's a very, Robert Heinlein's Tunnel in the Sky was a very obscure book. It's not a super big book, but as a kid, I loved it because the premise was these college kids, in order to graduate, basically they were using portal technology to basically, they'd send you from Earth to another planet. Earth was dying, so they were taking people and basically exploring the universe, and they would send you to a random planet, and part of your college graduation was you had to survive no matter where they sent you, and all they did was promise you, we won't send you into a vacuum where you're going to die instantly, but pretty much anything else you had to be prepared for. And these kids would have to come in, they could take whatever weapons they wanted, they could take whatever gear they wanted, but they had to be prepared for any environment, any condition, and any type of thing, and how to deal with aliens, and how to deal with all these kinds of unknown things. And it was a very fascinating thing, again, of like, what would you do if you had to, like, you know, be that going into this thing that you don't know anything about, right? And how do you even prepare for that and whatever and stuff. So if you're bored and you're looking for a good sci-fi book, I loved Tunnel in the Sky. Again, it's not a super massive book, but I really enjoyed it as a kid, and I still remember it to this day as being something that always inspired me, at a bunch of different levels and stuff. So, so let's see here. So the world. So we've already been kind of talking about the world a little bit, but the world, is kind of everything, in your universe at some levels, right? This is what your world building, your level design, things like that are all going to be revolving around. And so you need to kind of figure out, again, what are the things in the world that are interesting? Why is this world, there? And maybe the world is completely modern day, and maybe there's nothing special about the world, right? Maybe it's there's people in the world. Maybe it's just a modern day, love story. I mean, the world does not have to be a super special place, right? But you do need to define, at least at a minimum, to say, like, oh, well, this world for me, for this product that I'm building, takes place in, whatever, 2015, Chicago, blah, 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 during, this time and this era and stuff. And it can be completely and totally normal, right? And so don't feel like, the world building that you're doing doesn't necessarily have to be something that's going to be totally original and unique, right? But for the sake of this talk, and what we're talking about in this conversation, we are kind of talking about creating new places, new worlds, fantasy, science fiction, whatever it is, horror, doesn't matter, but creating places that are either some portion of our existing world or have something new, unique, and special that's different, there. So, for example, like The Matrix. The Matrix is an example of, like, in one hand, we started off in what we thought was our normal everyday world, right? And we had the city that was perceived as being something that was, in relatively today's society with some weird quirks, but, it felt like it was part of, maybe a slightly in the future type world, right? And then we had stuff where, suddenly they're like running on walls, or they're doing things that, like, some of these people had special powers or abilities. And you're like, whoa, wait, what just happened? Like, was that magic? Was that like superpowers? Is this superheroes now? Like, are we thinking this is Marvel? Or, we didn't know. Like, the first time we went and saw The Matrix, at least for me, I knew nothing about it. And so it was very fascinating because I didn't know what to expect. I had zero expectations. A bunch of my friends drugged me to it, not because I didn't want to go. I was busy working 24/7 on a project, and just wasn't even aware of it because I'd been so nosed down on something for a while. And my friends took me out to it, and it blew my mind, right? But then suddenly it's like they jack out, and suddenly now they're in the future, and and now you find that the Matrix is the Matrix, right? And all these kinds of things. And so that's a perfect example of where sometimes you might have a modern everyday world or the perception of it or some facsimile of it, and then you could still twist it, you can still turn it, you can still create something more or different with it, right? And so what you're trying to do is really figure out, whether that world, and again, let me step back from this just for a second to say, when we talk about the world, again, your product, your IP, even your full brand may not ever leave the building. It may not ever leave the city. So you might have an entire story that takes place inside of one building, right? And your universe may only be that one building. And that's totally adequate. That's totally fair. If you think that's all that it ever really is wanting to be, right? So I don't want you to necessarily think that the world has to be this place that you go out and literally like figure out what goes on this new planet Earth that you're figuring out, right? It could just be, one town or one city. If you're, doing a movie like Total Recall and you're going to Mars and like, yeah, that there's Mars and maybe, we're in a domed city and, most of our world takes place in that city. Now we might know and we see outside of it. And that's the thing you have to kind of know or understand or define again, that there's going to be certain information that's for you only. There's certain information that's kind of like hints and glimpses at what the world, the total world is. And then there's the world of the player, the viewer or the reader, right? And I'd say the world of the product, right? And so when you're defining these things, the farther out those things get away from you, the less defined those things need to be. So you don't have to spend a lot of time trying to define some of that stuff in like uber detail, right? So if something's really far away for now, maybe it doesn't need to exist, but it's just there to be interesting. It's just there to look good or whatever. And again, you may only be seeing it through a window. You may only be just knowing that it's there. But those little glimpses, those little things, I can't stress enough how important that stuff can be. I don't care whether you're in a Wild West, thing and you're riding on a train and you're riding across the United States on a train, you still want to have some shots where that train goes by a town or goes by, some big battle or goes by something. And when it does, it gives us a little bit of a glimpse of something else that's happening right now. It gives us some context of modern day of what's going on, right? And makes the world feel a little bit bigger. Even though our world's that train, our world, a good example of that would be, just totally drew a blank on the name of it. Help me out, guys. There was a recent movie that they also turned into a TV show that was all like post-apocalyptic where the world froze and they're on a train that's circling the globe and totally I'm drawing a blank on it. Anyways, I apologize. There's a fairly recent movie and TV show where they're stuck on a train and you can occasionally see the world out a window, but every just once in a while you see the frozen world out of the window of that train. But really their world is that train, right? Their world is that, is just what's on that train, and they're never going to get off it. Snowpiercer. Yes, the blasphemer, thank you. That was it. So if you guys haven't seen Snowpiercer, but just using that as an example of the world, when I'm defining that world, right? I'm, in my world document, I might say, look, it's, Earth in the future, it's frozen over completely and totally. There's a train that drives on it, and and this train, as we see it, it's going to go past some locations, and at some point, somewhere, somehow, we might define, okay, well, when we go by Chicago, we want to see some stuff or whatever, right? We want to get some glimpse there. Like there was a sequence where they showed some like people that were like frozen. They're like, they tried to escape or they tried to do something, and like it happened so fast that they like froze solid where they were at, kind of thing. Like, so the world has some like glimpses on to like how horrible it was, like how bad it was, and then they do have a few little flashbacks from the news and some things like that. So they use like news reports and stuff to build out the world a little bit bigger. So they do kind of use some techniques like that to try to show backstory, right? To show history. But that stuff's relatively minor. It sets up what happened. They don't spend a lot of time in it in the grand scheme of the overall movie. There's 5 minutes or whatever of time that they spend showing the past history. And so the world and the amount of definition that you would have to do as a world builder or as a game designer in that, if you were to build Snowpiercer the game, let's just say, right? Like the world design document page is probably like a one pager, right? Like if that, it's just like, here, it's a frozen world and there's some stuff there. And then maybe as you go down the road, maybe there's a couple special things in a cutscene or something that we might want to define, right? And then the world, in the Snowpiercer world, has some interesting places, some interesting locations. So outside of the train itself, there's some tunnels. Those tunnels do have like some occasions where there's like an avalanche or they're blocked or there's some stuff that's there. They've got like some cases, I believe, if I remember right. I can't remember if it was in the TV series or in the, I did watch the TV series, so it had some other stuff in it, but they had a bridge, for example. I remember at one point that they thought might collapse on them. And then at one point a second train comes in, and from one of the guys and the second train's coming to attack them and stuff. So the world is slightly bigger than the train, right? But not a whole lot. And so again, like I would probably write maybe a one pager at most on the world of Snowpiercer, right? So my point is that you don't have to do a lot, right? So there's a few things there. There's a few things of interest. There's a few things that tell story through environmental storytelling techniques, i.e. when I'm looking out windows. And then there's certain things that are told through some conversations, people talking to each other, or some flashbacks or news reports or things like that make that world a little bit more interesting. But unlike The Walking Dead or something like that, where I might have the ability to eventually fly to England or fly to California, or as we've seen with The Walking Dead, they're now, springing up sequels around, at least the US, in some different ways. And occasionally they're crossing over, between the sequels and stuff as people, cross over, and we're occasionally meeting people from other parts of the country or other countries, things like that. So again, like the Walking Dead universe is crossing over there, even though really, for all intents and purposes, most of the actors, most of the people, their real world is just kind of like in the original Walking Dead, like you think season 1, right? You don't know a whole lot about what's going on. There's not a lot of backstory. There's not, like, you don't learn where the virus came from. They don't explain zombies. They don't, go really do a lot of that kind of stuff. It's just like these things show up and bad things happen. Zombies show up and like all hell breaks loose, right? And that was all that they really had to do. And so that's perfectly acceptable, right? And then it was just really, what is their daily lives like? What is their little world in those square blocks that they're in, those square miles they're covering, when they travel. And so while you might want to define the entirety of the world, again, you might spend, if I was designing the Walking Dead universe, I might design 5 or 10 pages or whatever of like the overall world, right? What's happening in some different countries, or what's happening around the US, what's happening with the government, all those kinds of things, right? And transportation and trade and stuff like that. So understanding like, okay, what's going on in the world. And this is really, for right now in this conversation on this slide, we're really talking about the environment, right? And so just to be clear, this is not necessarily, they're both intermixed and they're both equally important, but we'll get to next is the people in the world, right? And so this is really the physical location, the cities, the landscapes, or whatever that is, within the world, and how that world itself is working. And that's what we're talking about here and what we're trying to build again. And keep in mind that, some games are going to have a lot of travel. Some games you're going to go, through massive worlds, or World of Warcraft or something like that, right? You've got entire continents that you're like exploring, and some of these games can literally be the size of massive continents, right? And especially some of these big open world games and things, they're huge. So just saying, like, the world itself can be really, really, really big. It can be really small, and it really just depends on what your needs are. But you really, again, have to define what are these things in it that make the world interesting, and maybe the answer is nothing. So like weather and environment. So like if you look at The Walking Dead, Yeah, occasionally there's a storm, occasionally there's a little bit of rain, but even that, there's not a whole lot. And it's really just kind of like the weather's kind of mundane, really, for the most part, other than just an occasional, thing that happens there. Versus Snowpiercer, where the weather, is crazy and causes all kinds of problems, right? So I'm just saying, like, they can have you can have both extremes, in your IPs, right? And so it's not a requirement that weather be something that has to be, crazy or strange or weird, but you have to ask yourself, like, well, okay, if I'm on an alien planet, like, does it make sense that, like, it's just a nice, bright, sunny day, like we have in, on a summer day here in our own lives, or is it, does it need to be some weird weather that's a little different, that feels alien, right? That feels different. Or is the weather being impacted by story elements and story things? Is there a volcano that's erupting that's causing all sorts of, clouds and ash, and that's turning to rain, which causes, lightning storms and, all these other things. And so there's a case of, like, backstory and history and the world and the environment now are causing, a causal effect, right? Of, like, well, those things can now actually be changing the gameplay, for example. And so now, whether that volcano is erupting right next to me or whether it's a massive, super volcano that's erupting, and it's just, causing, all sorts of stuff to happen. Like, what does that do to me, right? How does that affect how I'm playing, how I'm driving, how I'm shooting, where I have to hide right now, or something like that. I recently just saw a few weeks ago a movie called Iceland, and if you guys haven't seen it yet, I think it's Gerard Butler. I'm trying to remember, one of those guys, a fairly famous actor who stars in it, and I thought it was a pretty good take on the comet coming to Earth and trying to, it's fragmenting and causing all these pieces, and it ultimately is going to cause a nuclear winter, and they're trying to get to these bunkers to survive that the government set up. But in that particular case, the weather is kind of it's the weather and the environment really is, these meteors are coming down, they're starting to destroy the Earth, they're destroying cities, they're throwing up ash, and causing massive lightning storms and other kinds of things. They're causing weird rain and acid, and and then the pieces of the comet are also coming down and destroying things and causing like this, like, comet rain almost, where there's just all these fireballs are hitting the ground and blowing up cars and all these things. And so there's a perfect example of how the world, the environment, which included the Earth, which was modern day, but now you add this outside comet that's streaking at us and it's fragmenting and it's breaking up, as it's coming at us, right? And there's a central chunk that's what's going to be our, the planet killer for the most part. But ahead of it are all these little chunks that are going to now, like, cause all this, days and weeks of terror and chaos and problems, and the entire movie and the entire world is all built around that, right? And then some of these, movies and these IPs, like that movie or anything like it, like these post-apocalyptic movies, there's the events leading up to it, there's the event itself, and then there's the post event of, like, what happens after, right? How does society rebuild? And so your universe might exist in all three. Your universe, maybe day one, you're going to start off in the post-apocalyptic world, right? Maybe it's The Walking Dead, and we're 20 years, after the virus and the zombies appear, right? And maybe that's where game one starts. But, who's to say we don't do 2 or 3 games and then end up doing a prequel or the equivalent thereof? And so now maybe we go back and we play something that's, maybe the first quarter of the game or whatever it is. It goes back to before the zombies were there, and we're dealing with some a bunch of stuff back in that world, and then the zombie thing happens and we live through and have to fight through that whole things of the zombies happening. And then maybe it's the first few days, weeks, or months, post invasion, post apocalypse, and all that kind of thing, when everything's going down, right? And so again, with history and the world, you're trying to put all these things together, and you're trying to, like, understand, like, how do I fit all these pieces? Because there's histories and the mythologies. There's also technology that's kind of coming into there, right? And then the world itself is fun and interesting, but you're also trying to make this, a world usually that's something that is memorable, right? And so again, you might only be doing a romance story that's just about two characters falling in love, and the world itself is just a fun place, and and things, and doesn't have to be much. Or the world can be like last night I watched a movie called Adrift, and whatever 90%, 80% of the story takes place on a boat, that's been destroyed in a storm. It's a true story, and this girl spends almost 2 months or whatever on a boat, trapped by herself and trying to survive. And so pretty much her world is the ocean and this boat, right? And the world's not any bigger than that. And so yes, there's some flashbacks in the movie that go back to her with her boyfriend and their life previously and stuff. So the world in the story does include history, right? But her current modern day dilemma, gameplay, or whatever is really about what's happening to her right now. Her world is only as big as her little boat, right? So and even that's not, I guess, a little bit of the water around her. That she dives into occasionally, right? So my point is the world doesn't have to be, this big, huge, massive place. Now, cultures in society are probably the most complicated thing that we can put into our universes and stuff. And this is one of those things that is probably one of the trickiest to put into here, is understanding, again, like, what is it within our world, with our thing? Is this a historical or modern day present thing on Earth? Is this an alien culture, an alien society? Is it historical, in something, again, it could be ancient Aztecs or whatever that thing is. And how does their society differ? Because even in our modern day world, one of the misnomers we have, if you're, from a particular place, like I think especially guilty of this as Americans, in that quite often we see things from our own jaded perspectives, right? We see things and go like, oh, okay, our whole little world is about this, about us, and about, the world revolves around us as Americans typically, and stereotypically, right? And so our culture, and we see and how we judge everybody else, whether we say we do or not, we judge other people based by our morals and our principles, right? And that's where different cultures and different societies will have different ways of functioning, different ways of working, different things that are right and wrong, and stuff like that. And so we have to really understand, what is it about how the cultures currently work, and then at some point maybe a little bit of backstory about like how they came about, and then what's really important to understand is like, okay, how do these cultures differ, right? And so those things could be in the way that they think, or what's kind of their, are they a culture that believes, in doing something that's like they can be very aggressive, right? There could be a culture, like if you look at the Klingons in Star Trek, right? The Klingons are these really highly aggressive race, they're all about, fighting. And then you look at the Vulcans, and they're all about logic and math, and they're very similar in some regards. They're aliens and they're different, but they're polar opposites, right? One's very logical, science-based. One's about, fighting and things like that. And each race kind of has its culture, right? It's society that's around that. And, and for better or for worse, they've built all these, religions around it. They've built all of the things that they do, their customs, their techniques, like the Vulcan society, the Ponfar, where they've got to, do their mating rituals, or or they've got all these other challenges and different things that they're all designed, to do stuff. And the Klingons are kind of the same way in how they challenge each other for rulers and ships, and how they're going to go to, it's not Valhalla, but their equivalent of heaven, things like that through combat and stuff, right? And so all these things, of how a culture and a society manifests itself could have a very, 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 very significant impact on your world, right? And whether that's through politics or religion or whatever. I mean, look at how divided even America is right now between its Democrats and Republicans. Like just that one political thing, the Trump Biden stuff. And I'm not going to get into politics here. This is not a channel for that. But the point of that is that just that one difference is such a big difference that it's just kind of like you're in one group or the other right now, and, and it's very polarized. And even though we're all Americans and we should all be in this together, in my opinion, and we should be working together and all these kinds of things, like those camps are very like, they're very like magnetically polar opposites. Like, do not come close to me if you're, supporting the other person that I don't believe in, right? And so that manifests itself in like so many different things and so many different ways, and bad politics and bad, things and, and stuff. And it really can tear apart a society and change it, right? And that's a relatively small thing. Not to say that problem we're having in America right now is not valid or legitimate, but if you think about, the Klingons versus the Vulcans versus the humans, is this kind of weird three ways of three different groups that don't get along typically, but yet there's exceptions, right? Worf and, Spock and various people from those races have come to serve on the Enterprise, and have been part of their universe. But as a general societal whole, there's generally, all these things that build up within these two groups that basically make them either fight directly or like have high tension where they don't like each other, they're mistrusting each other, things like that. That can definitely be seen, especially a lot of the early Star Trek stuff with Captain Kirk, and then they evolved the Vulcans and the Klingons, and there's more getting along now, or at least there was, depending on where you are in their universe, right? But I'm just saying that these things cause wars. These things cause conflict. These things even go to how they dress, how they look. What kinds of tactics do they use? The Vulcans and stuff, are going to be a little bit more peace loving and more science based, and they're not necessarily. It's not to say that they haven't attacked first, but they're typically not that type, right? Versus the Klingons, which are going to be the super highly aggressive race, and they're going to go off and just kill you first and ask questions later. And so there is no logic there, right? It's just pure primal instinct. And that goes to the way they look, the way they talk, the way they act, the way their culture is set up, the way their religions are set up, the way their, governments are set up, the way their technology is set up, their military is set up. So everything, in that society revolves around the central belief of, how they think about other people, and even each other, and how they put, their aggressions and their war and that stuff is at the forefront of their society, right? And so now sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. So to pause for just a second, sometimes we can use stereotypes, right? We have stereotypes out there in our world, whether we're storytellers, whether these are existing tropes that are within, other material like the Klingons that are highly aggressive, to other races that are very peaceful, to other races that are, like the Romulans who are very sneaky, or look at shows like Dune, movies, books, like Dune with the Bene Gesserats and, the Atreides and, and the Emperor and many of these groups all fit stereotypes. And stereotypes are there for a reason because, again, back to rules, we understand these things because these rules exist. These rules make our lives easier, right? These rules allow us to understand the universe a little bit easier, and we don't have to explain as much, right? We can explain these guys as a very like easygoing, kind of peaceful society. And then we don't have to go much farther than that, right? We can just have like, oh yeah, they're a easy, peaceful society, and just kind of leave it at that, and then and not go any farther, right? And so that we don't need to then keep explaining who or why these people are because they follow a stereotype, right? And so quite often, if you look at the Klingons, you look at the Vulcans, you look at the Romulans, you look at again a lot of these societies and cultures. By them following some type of a stereotype, at least to some degree, now it doesn't mean they can't have their little twists, right? They can have their little things where you're like, there's always an exception or there's always something there. But that's important, right? We need to understand, why those things are important, right? What those things are, and why, they matter to us. And then how do we just tweak them again, whether that's an 80-20 rule or 90-10 or whatever. But again, a stereotype can work really well in cultures and societies because it allows us as humans, as players, viewers, watchers, readers, whatever, to understand that universe a little bit faster, because cultures and societies quite often can be really confusing. And trying to understand the complexities of our own government's almost impossible to me, and let alone, God forbid, trying to understand the Chinese Communist Party or, the Russian current, government, which I guess is technically communist, and, or the English, monarchy, and like just trying to understand the nuances of those things. Like, I don't get, like, right. I kind of know those things. So by just sort of saying that, like, for example, this group is, communist, or this group is, whatever it is, then you can just, like, you don't really have to explain anymore. That could be all you really need for your thing. And maybe that doesn't even matter. Maybe politics doesn't matter, right? But that's something you have to kind of, figure out and understand. What are these things going to be, to do? And then this especially gets extremely confusing when you're talking about aliens and alien societies, where there really isn't. Now, again, you can have, I would argue that things like the Klingons, again, are a little bit of a stereotype, and that they're, that stereotype is there for a reason, and that stereotype is something that, even though that maybe doesn't exist in today's society, but you could hearken them back to, say, Genghis Khan, or, some groups that have existed in our society historically, and that, the Klingons could be sort of like that, this really hyper aggressive race, but it's still a stereotype and a trope we understand. And so an alien society can have a stereotype, right? It can fit our stereotypes, and sometimes that's easier to do, again, to have an alien race fit those stereotypes, because it's easier for us to understand what they are, who they are, what they want, what they're doing, versus aliens could also just be like, who knows what, right? And it can be just completely out there, and that's where it can be, pretty confusing, for a lot of people, right? Let's see. Now, when we're getting into the effects of society, this is where it's probably the kind of the metals meeting the road, and where this probably, if you're making a game or most movies and things like that, this is probably one of the most important, aspects that you really have to understand, because ultimately, conflict is really important. And I'll put in they have a book here in the chat channel. So, there's a book called Conflict, Action, and Suspense. And it's an older book. I remember I read it, like, I think in college, maybe high school even. So that was like, thousands of years ago. But it was a really good book on trying to understand, again, conflict. And where does conflict come from? Where do these things go? Like, how do you build worlds and build things because conflict is ultimately what drives most worlds. That's just human nature is, for better, for worse, and really for worse, we are a very political group of human beings in general. I don't care whether you have a 10-person company or a 10 million person company, you're going to have politics. Like, it's just part of our human nature. I've tried having small companies in the past, and I just thought, like, hey, we'll have a small company so we won't have politics, because I hate politics. And like, I don't have time for that BS. And it amazed me that, like, even in a 10-person company, how much politics there can still be. And so, but that's part of it. And that politics leads to conflict, right? Politics leads to differences of opinions. Differences of opinions lead to conflict. And those conflicts can escalate up and ultimately lead to a war, or, and things like that. And, and whether it's just a fist fight in the parking lot, which I've been at game companies where I've had employees fight literally with their fists, that they've gotten so upset with each other, like, right? So, whether it's a conflict of a bunch of people in the same room, and and again, your universe might only be in that building, in that one room, in that one thing on the train, right? Look at Snowpiercer. They've got lots of battles between the back of the train and the front of the train. They've set up in their society classes. They have different levels, different categories of, what your status is, right? How rich were you? However they define that. They don't really get into who was what and why and all those kinds of things. But in that, they definitely have at least at a minimum, by the most generalized thing, they have the front of the train, the back of the train, the rich people, the poor people, right? The rich people got windows and nice food and, all the luxuries. The people in the back are just in cattle cars and they're barely alive and they're fed these little bricks of, they don't even know what they are, some kind of substance, which, is pretty scary. Turns out to be ground bugs. Sorry if I ruined it for people, but super nasty, right? And that's all they've lived on for 30 years or something like that. It's crickets or something. And so versus the steak and, and lobster and things that the front of the train has, right? So that ultimately is going to fester. That ultimately, that difference in what people are ultimately leads to conflict. It doesn't matter who you are. The rich versus the poor is the oldest conflict in the world. You're right. Two people that want the same thing. Helen of Troy, and the Trojan War, like that entire war was over a girl. Right? And that was just, the conflict of two guys being guys and being stupid, right? There's a million other girls in the world, but they both had to have that same one because she was beautiful and all those things, right? So conflict can come from many different sources, but it quite often is over resources. It's quite often over, people want the same place. Look at Jerusalem in our current world is a key factor where all these different religions think it's their religious home, right? And so there is a tremendous amount of conflict to this day that Israel has to endure over who owns Jerusalem, because everybody feels that that's their religious right to own Jerusalem, right? And so it becomes this constant battle, for them, and it's not easy. But that's a perfect example of religion is a huge good and bad thing, and that it can lead to just as much fighting, turmoil, that's going on in Jerusalem today, to whether it was the Crusades, back in ancient times, to whatever, right? There's always going to be conflict over religion, and there's always going to be conflict over politics. There's always going to be conflict over resources and just people trying to stay alive. There's always going to be conflict over, guys wanting the girl, and things like that, right? And then you have so that's one layer of it, but then you have whole layers of bad guys and good guys and gray areas and things that are really clear about, who does what and why and when and how, those kind of things, right? And so, so it's important when you're building all these things out to really understand what your world needs, right? What is your world going to have in it? And how do all these things really work together? Because conflict needs to be this perpetual motion machine. Conflict has to be usually something when you're world building. I think the biggest problem is that conflict has to be never ending. And any good story is always going to have conflict. Always. Look at, even human history, and stuff. We've never had in my opinion, if you look at the scale of human history, we've never had a really long period of time of peace, right? And so whether that's, hours, days, years, centuries, whatever that is, there's always some sort of conflict that's inevitably going to keep festering to the top, right? That seems to be human nature and just the way that we expect our worlds to work. But the enemy in that machine of bad things that keep happening obviously keeps changing. Genghis Khan is not the one that's attacking, America in 1942. That's Hitler, right? But the point is that people get, when you're doing, this stuff, right? You want to be able to have enemies and villains and conflict be sort of inherently part of everything, that there's imbalance in the world, right? And I'd say that this is, again, one of the trickiest things to sort of build, in that you have to kind of keep also building for who's going to be that next bad guy, right? Who's going to be, the next villain, in the world. And I think sometimes when it comes out of nowhere, it can kind of catch people by surprise, and they're kind of like, whoa, wait a second, like that didn't make any sense, and so the rules again get broken or get tweaked, and then it throws us off, right? And so, for example, if we were doing a game and we had a really main bad guy, and we do that game and we kill off that bad guy, and we in essence kill off the story and we end the story, then if we start up a sequel, where's the next bad guy come from? Because I now need another bad guy. The inherent nature of most games, or at least action games, is that there's conflict, right? And that means there's fighting. And if there's going to be fighting, ultimately there's usually somebody I'm trying to kill or stop or arrest or whatever it is, but I'm trying to get to someone and I'm trying to stop them. And that's generally the role of a player hero versus the bad guy, right? And this is a common theme that we're going to see across most movies, most games, most things, if they are, an action type thing. And so, what's interesting with that is that, again, we need to understand, within that mechanism, like, how are these things going to keep moving? How are they going to keep going? What's our next Hitler? What's our next Mussolini? What's our next Genghis Khan? And are they already kind of there, right? In our society today, it's not really super clear where our next enemy is, right? But there's always tension out there. Like, the stuff in Iran right now is kind of bubbling a little bit, and and we're kind of like, so if suddenly Iran and the US were at war tomorrow, we wouldn't be all that shocked, right? Now some people would be like, oh my God, what happened? Like, I didn't see that coming. But in reality, there's probably, a lot of people would be like, yeah, I get it. There's still tension there. And probably a lot of this goes back to 9/11. And a lot of this even goes back even farther in generations, of stuff that have built up over time, and the hostilities between two societies, two cultures, again, that don't trust each other. We have different religions. We have different societal values. Definitely a huge gap in wealth. Right? And so these are all things that lead to conflict. These are all things that lead to somebody being unhappy, and ultimately, somebody wants to either make some money, somebody's, wants to do something just because they're a religious zealot, or they want to do something because they think it's the right thing to do, or they're doing it for their government, or whatever it is, right? And whether it's a Cold War type scenario, or whether it's an active war, it doesn't matter. It's still, there can be conflict, there can be tension, in these things. And you want these things to build and build and build and build and build, and then suddenly they explode, right? And so within a product, you could have something building, and then like a small explosion, but you could also have something at the same time building a little bit more, and then explodes even bigger later, right? So there could be one conflict that you get sidetracked on. You think that conflict is, really what you're after, right? And then you're seeing something else kind of building back here, but it's not a priority. So that when this bubble pops, whether I'm the one that, like, maybe I kill this bad guy, right? He could be a sub boss or whatever. I kill him. And then suddenly, this other bigger boss now sees this vacuum, this opportunity, or he gets his hands on a piece of technology or a bomb or whatever that this other guy sort of had, which now gives him the final piece that he needs to suddenly now shift over and do something even bigger, right? And so, you want these things to work together so that our societies and these conflicts and stuff are building constantly. And so for one product, you might have a couple different things that are happening, a couple different plot lines, a couple different societal things and other stuff that are going, together. But some of those may not even become apparent until the sequel or until the next game after that, right? So that one smaller explosion of that one guy that in that first plot that I overcome, maybe that's the end of game one, right? But I've seen this other thing happening. I've seen this other thing building. I've seen these guys, like these other two sides might be kind of fighting, and I'm like, okay, you guys like have fun. I'm not getting involved, but it's getting worse and worse and worse. And at some point, often we have to take sides, right? So as a society, especially Americans and people like that are the police, or we see ourselves as the policemen of the world now for whatever reason, we have to go in there and right the wrongs or take a side or back up our allies or whatever. So at some point, these things start to happen. At some point, we're going to step in and go like, okay, guys, break it up. Or like, wait, you're picking on my friend. And so now, like, I'm going to come in and, and fight you too, right? And so there's those kinds of things. need to be pre-thought, and again, that's what's tricky with a lot of these universe building things is you have to be thinking about the future of conflict, right? And how are these things going to build, and what makes logical sense to your consumer who's looking at this thing, and again, try to not surprise them and try to not just be like, oh, by the way, suddenly, whatever it is, France now has a nuclear bomb and they're going to use it against the U.S. And you'd be like, what? Like the French? Like, they're, let them go back to their girlfriends. Like they're bored, something. I don't know. But like the French are not going to nuke the U.S. Like it would be so like out of place. I mean, yes, on one hand, we could kind of see it happening, I guess. But, it would take a lot of explaining to try, if there's a rogue group within France or a rogue group or terrorists or whatever, like, okay, explainable. But if it's like the French government and suddenly is just pissed at the U.S. and decides they're going to nuke us tomorrow, like, where'd that come from, right? Like, there was no conflict, there was no action, there was no suspense, there was no buildup, right? And that buildup and that tension within a story that we'll get into later weeks about how to build that tension in story is so important, right? You don't want it to come out of the blue. So that's just something you need to be, kind of aware of. And so, again, part of this also is just setting up the groups and who all these different groups are. So in an open world game, if you're doing like GTA or things like that, typically it's not always black and white. Like it's not always just like good guys, bad guys, like, Americans, Russians. Like, yeah, that could be the two groups. And maybe that's all there is. But quite often there's, there's these two groups, and there might be some people or individuals that are like double, traitors, and they're playing both sides, double agents, so they could be living in a gray world. But there could also be, third parties who are neutral, and those people could be watching. There could be bad guys. There could be other kinds of things. And so an interesting world and universe quite often has different types of people that have different agendas and different politics and different alliances. And one group may like another group may hate another group group may be neutral to that same group, right? And or any number of variations along a scale. It's not just black and white of like, I love you, I hate you, I don't care about you, right? Like that's the most obvious, but again, it doesn't have to sort of be that way. So take like two rival gangs, right? Take a game like a GTA or something like that. And in real life, you have two rival gangs. Now, those rival gangs may like to fight each other, right? But they also may kind of come to a peace agreement, like, this is my area, this is your area, like, don't cross that line, we're okay. Like, we're cool as long as we're there, we're both gangbangers, and that's totally fine. Now, let a third gang show up that's from completely out of town, right? And these two gangs are with their territories here. That third gang comes in and tries to take over both their territories. You generally would bet that both of these guys who used to be enemies are suddenly like, okay, like we may not like each other, but this third guy, he's got to go. Like, and so they're going to come in and probably work together to kill him. And then when the cops come in, to try to fight that whole mess, now the gangbangers are kind of like, oh, wait a second, like we don't like each other, but we sure don't like the cops, right? And so now, now they may or may not be aggressive as far as like killing the cops or shooting at them or whatever. That's, depends on your world, right? But they're sure not going to like the cops. They're sure not going to help the cops. They're sure not going to do it unless they're forced into it, right? Because they both, have a distrust for law enforcement in general. And so that's the way these different factions and groups and things like that can really lead to a lot of different gameplay. Because now, these guys might have an area, but within that area, might have certain resources I need. It might have certain technologies I need. These guys might have access to certain things I need, information I need, and they might give me certain quests and all these kinds of things. And so you have to kind of understand, like, what are the things that these factions and groups give to you, as a consumer, right? So next, talk a little bit about time travel. I won't deep dive into this, but just to say that in your world, if you have time travel, look out. It's definitely not the easiest thing to have, in your world. And all the paradoxes of time travel can really get complicated really fast. And especially if people can jump forward and backwards, and all the different, paradoxes, alternate universes, alternate dimensions, and how they control it, and all that kind of stuff can get really messy really quickly. Lots of paradoxes in there, lots of weird stuff that can go on there, and some of it can just get, extremely strange, right? And so definitely be aware that, how you travel in time and what you're allowed to affect in time. And it's one thing if it's done through a cutscene and it's sort of there, but if the player can control it, it gets really hard, right? Now, time travel could also be like slowing time, or maybe a slight, like some Prince of Persia type games, whatever, or maybe I can jump back 10 seconds, or I can do, something really simple and basic, in my time travel. So maybe it's not traveling back thousands of years. But, you never know, right? And, things like, there's been a number of movies and things like that have even had stuff where, they go all the way back to the age of the dinosaurs, and they step on one butterfly, and that one, they call it the butterfly effect, right? And that one butterfly basically the death of that one butterfly basically affects some creature, who maybe was going to eat it, for example, and then the creature that was going to eat that creature, ultimately didn't eat it, and so on and so forth. And when you suddenly fast forward 10 million years, that chain reaction of suddenly all these creatures ended up in different places and changed their behavior and changed something that ultimately led to, say, maybe a particular person doesn't die or does die because maybe this person now gets eaten, because, somebody was hungry because that one creature that was supposed to show up didn't show up, and so now this creature goes looking for another meal, ends up killing somebody, and this could be back in 5000 BC, but now that person, fast forward, doesn't have some children, and those children don't have children, don't have children, don't have children, and suddenly I wasn't born, right? And that's the idea behind the butterfly effect. And so if you take time travel seriously, it can get messy quickly. If you're just making a fun game, of course you can write your own rules, but again, this is where people have certain expectations. And so I think if you're jumping once or twice, or just doing like a little bit, like probably not too hard on your story at some levels. If the player is jumping around a lot and you're trying to affect things and things are affecting things which affect things, and all these kinds of stuff, then the paradox can get pretty bad pretty quickly, and can lead to a lot of problems, right? And so I just want you to be aware of that, in that, that lots of different weird alternate dimensions and things can happen, in the time travel, paradoxes that you definitely want to again, be careful about. And ultimately, you want to learn how to control it in your universe. Like, again, is it something that's just going to be a one-time thing? Is it going to be something the players do all the time? Is it something that, that requires a special device, magic, special ability, powers, whatever that is, right? But how do you control time travel? Because if it's uncontrolled, then it can, obviously cause all kinds of weird paradoxes. I think, some shows like Terminator have done it really well. Terminator did have a lot where it played with a lot of those paradoxes, where the Terminators went back in time, to kill Sarah Connor, like in the original Terminator movie. And it's interesting to see because, in their premise, the Terminators themselves were able to go through their particular time portal because they were covered in human flesh. And their quick explanation was that the portal basically only allowed things that were fleshy to go through. So that's why you went through naked and you didn't bring any weapons, and stuff per se. But the Terminators, had their internal exoskeletons and things like that. So they were able to bring some of that with them and at least have some limited ability. Even though the original Arnold T-1000 only had, he was stronger, faster, smarter, better vision, things like that, right? But he didn't have any weapons, unlike, I think it was T-100, and then the T-1000, I believe, was the liquid metal. one. So then you had some stuff like that, again, some of that paradoxes shifted a little bit, but they tried to control the fact that this was kind of a one-time deal. I think in the storyline, they even destroy the time travel machine. So it's just like they know it's kind of just those two guys. They explain some of the paradoxes. They try not to talk about certain things, and all that. But it's definitely like it's something that they had to kind of explain away that also made the story kind of fair and reasonable. Because, yeah, if Arnold or, any of the Terminators had come through with their full arsenal and you could have walked through this time travel portal with anything you wanted, you definitely, like, the world, it had been pretty hard for any of our modern day humans to even have a chance to fight these things, right? So to kind of continue on with groups and cultures and stuff, a little bit, to dive a little deeper, there's a tremendous amount of different groups and organizations that are possible, within a world building exercise. And really, next to the characters themselves, in my opinion, these groups and organizations are some of the most important, if not the most important things in your universe. Because again, these things all have just massive impact on the world, and how it's structured and where and what I can do, where I can go, the boundaries politically of like, United States versus Canada versus Mexico. Like I can't just easily walk across the border and go from one country to another. I can't easily necessarily just jump on an airplane, and fly, from here to China. Like I need to have a visa. I need to have, things that are there. I have to have a passport and stuff, right? And so some of these things need to be explained away or have to be explained away or should be explained away, right? And that's the kind of stuff that you need to sort of understand, when you're making your game, right? You need to be kind of aware of that. And that there's a lot of these different factions and these different things that exist in the world, that ultimately you need to define who they are, how they affect the player, how they affect the universe, and and how they work together, versus who's fighting with whom, who's allied with whom, and in which ways and how, and again, all these nuances can either just be kind of backstory and not really matter too much. Like for example, if an alien came to the planet right now and said, landed in the United States and said like, I want to talk to your leader, or, I want to talk to who's in charge. Yeah, it would go to the president, and there's a bit of probably a bipartisan, like we wouldn't really care whether you're Republican, Democrat, whatever. We might have two factions, but, in the case of somebody attacking us or something else, we probably would band together and those political differences would go away hopefully pretty quickly. But in the same hand, as soon as the threat was gone, suddenly those political differences are probably going to come back and, and bite us in the butt again. So we need to be careful, and understand those things. Now, really the most important thing in your world is your characters. And, these are the things that we as human beings tend to attach to the most. We have more empathy. We have more understanding. We get what characters are, what we, especially the more humanoid they are, the more that we can understand their facial expressions and, when we see things and know, what they're doing, right? Like we understand these facial expressions, and we don't have to even explain them away. But if you start adding some weird creature that's got strange stuff and tentacles and, and he's like doing this because he's happy, like, do we understand that? Like, or do I need to be like, have somebody literally call it like, oh, he's happy. Like his little things are flapping fast or whatever, right? So that's the kind of stuff where if we get into aliens or get into other things, it gets harder. But as characters, especially as humanoid characters, these things can be, really critical to us wanting to be engaged with the story, with this property, with this universe, because we identify and associate more with it. We know who bad guys are. We understand conceptually who a bad guy is. We don't necessarily have to say he's a bad guy. We can see him, doing something bad and know that bad thing is ultimately, makes him a bad guy, right? We know that we probably got to kill him or arrest him or avoid him or do whatever we're going to do with him or go partner with him, right? I mean, the bad guy term I'm using this is to be somebody who's opposite of who we are. But again, it could be in a particular game we're playing, as a criminal and we're looking for other criminals, right? So maybe the group that we're trying to hang out with could be that. But all these people need to be interesting characters. They all need to go through growth. They all need to go through change. They need to be, have personalities, and stuff. And that's something that's really, important to get across. And that, everybody again, back to this high level, mile high bullet point thing of what are these things, right? And that these things are filling buckets. These things, it doesn't necessarily matter, when I'm initially writing my story, it doesn't matter whether I have one ally, two allies, or 100 allies, right? In the end, I need to know there's allies. I mean, is there a group or groups, and there could be several, that are ultimately people who help us, right? And people that do things for us. Some of these people could be, other groups could be completely neutral. They're not going to help us, but they're not going to shoot at me either, right? And so that can be an important thing to also kind of understand. So allies are people that help us versus a teammate who's literally like on our team, usually it shows that they're going along with us on this thing. And so whether that's a direct, I'm on SEAL Team 6 and these guys are my teammates, or whether it's just like, hey, we're in this together, Luke and Han and Chewie all partner up as friends, but also as teammates, right? And or I should say they at least start off it really starts off almost in a vendor relationship, meaning that Luke is paying Han to fly him to a location. So Han is a taxi to start with, right? That's how their relationship starts, is Han is getting paid to take Luke to a place for money. But as that relationship grows, as trust grows and things like that, they become friends. And then after that, they ultimately become teammates and learn to help each other, all the way down to the end of episode, 4 or 5, whatever, and they're destroying the Death Star, and and Han was like, sorry, I'm not going on this last battle with you, like I'm not risking my neck, and he takes off in the Millennium Falcon, and then Luke's, right at that last second, Darth Vader's about to kill him, and Han comes in at the last second and shoots Darth Vader, and you're all clear, kid, and he comes in and saves him. He does that because he's his friend. He does that because he's his, also kind of his teammate, right? And so those relationships are everything in the story. Those relationships, like give us hope, give us excitement, give us, things that we want those things in our lives often, or we want, those friends, those allies, and those things. We understand those people there, right? And then we also understand that there's just neutral people in the world. If I'm going to the grocery store, tonight to get some groceries, I'm not going to check out the grocery store. At least for me, I don't go to the grocery store and be like, hey, what's your name? You're checking me out? And like, you're a checker. I haven't seen you here before. Like, hey, where'd you grow up? And where you been? You don't go there and then like, this person's an NPC. This person's a vendor. Like, I'm not necessarily there to make friends with it. Now, sometimes that happens. And I definitely do have friends that amaze me in their ability. I'm super social. I'm super extroverted. But I got friends that are like 10x me. And they will literally talk to every single stranger that walks down the road. I can't stand it. It drives me nuts. I don't like talking to strangers. If I know you, I'll talk your ear off and never shut up. But, if I don't know you, I'm like, I don't need to introduce myself, right? And so, unless there's some business stuff there where it might be at a trade show or something, and I know who you are, I know what company you work for, maybe I'll try to introduce myself. But the point being is that certain people are neutral for a reason, and those characters don't need to be developed. Those characters don't need to have all the nuances and all the crazy stuff, to go with them, right? Those characters just exist to help fill out the world. Hi, Megan. Yep, I'm always talking my ear off or my head off or whatever. I'm talking your ear off for sure. You get a lot of it, but hopefully the gift of gab is something that is benefiting you guys. So, let me rush through. We got a few more minutes. So let me get through these last couple slides here. Big glob. I don't know whether to hug you guys or be offended, but yes, I can talk a little bit. And the hard part is you guys can see, like, I have some slide decks, but I spent maybe 30 minutes preparing, an hour at the most for this talk. So for me to talk to you guys for 2 hours, hopefully you guys appreciate and respect the fact that, like, I don't do much prep work. Like, I come into this thing and kind of just talk off my heart, and stuff. So I apologize. It's not always the best prepared, the most like thoroughly thought through, but hopefully you still get some value out of it. But it is definitely, something that's hard for me to do. And so hopefully you can appreciate the fact that getting up here and talking for 2 hours is definitely, pretty brutal. Anyways, let's talk about bad guys real quick. Got 7 more minutes or so. Good. Thanks, Big Lob. I appreciate it. So bad guys, like, this is kind of a no-brainer. Like, we understand bad guys are bad guys, and there's lots of different things. Again, there's stereotypes, there's archetypes, there's different ways. You don't have to have a bad guy that's going to be like just like, hey, I've never seen this thing before, right? I mean, Hitler's Hitler, and Khan and the Wrath of Khan, is him, and like bad guys can often be defined in a very easy way, and bad guys can be like very multidimensional and like have lots of depth, and quite often we don't know who the real bad guy is, and there's the boss of the boss of the boss who might be your best friend and you don't even know it, and and so sometimes the guy who's the real mastermind may be somebody you think is a friend, and he doesn't even get revealed until the end of the story. But again, some of that can be confusing when the rules are like, hey, there's this guy who's your best friend, and then literally the last 30 seconds of the movie, he pulls out a gun and tries to shoot you because you find out like he's the big boss, right? Like, if there's not been any foreshadowing, some alluding to that, some building to that, a little bit of hinting at that or something, it just, you blow the rules of the universe all the way out, right? But what's important to, thanks to Vossmer, appreciate it. So hopefully you understand that in any kind of really, I don't care whether you're in a military, whether you're in a criminal organization, or whatever it is, the part of the nature of life is that there's hierarchies, right? Not everybody's created equal, as much as we like to believe that, right? There's going to be somebody who's in charge, and generally he has henchmen, and generally those are sub-bosses or some kind of thing, and then those guys have bosses, and those guys have their minions who have their minions, so on and so forth, right? There's structures and hierarchies to how these things work, and so what's important for you is to map that out, to kind of define that and understand like who they are, what they do, how they operate. Are these guys like really bad? Are the Yakuza? They'll just kill you, whatever, if you mess with them, or is it somebody else that's maybe a slightly bad guy? They're more white criminal, and they're going to hack your computers and they're going to mess you up, but they're not necessarily going to pull out a gun and blow your head off, right? And so where do bad guys lie in the spectrum of bad, right? Is it white collar? Is it totally vicious? Is it like, hey, we're trying to blow up the universe, right? And we're trying to literally send everybody to hell, because we just had a bad day, so where is the spectrum of bad guys in the grand scheme of things? And and again, what's their hierarchies? And always, again, like I talked about earlier, how do we set up the next guy? We always got to be thinking in our stories, what is that next thing that's coming that's going to be that bad thing, and then how the wars and conflicts work, right? Creatures, this we don't have to cover in too depth, but creatures, monsters, and just anything else that are in the world, these are just things that generally the definition between, say, a bad guy or whatever would be that these are things that are not necessarily going to be necessarily super intelligent. Doesn't mean they're stupid, but doesn't necessarily mean that that you walk up and have conversations with them, or there's at least a perception that they're more of a animal, creature, dinosaur, whatever it is, an orc or whatever. It doesn't mean that they're, there, but even like an orc, I would actually classify into characters versus creatures, right? So orcs have a race, a civilization, things like that. We may see them as there. Now, a troll might technically classify as like a creature, right? They're just big and dumb, whatever, and stuff. So it's up to you. There's no right or wrongs here. It's up for you to define what's a creature versus what is a character, or what is a group, what is a faction, a race, or something like that, right? And then, in your universe, you also just need to create a lot of things. What are all those things? We talked about technology levels. We talked about all of these kinds of things. But again, what are the things in your world and your universe that are important, right? What are those things that matter? If I crash land on a planet and it's a desert planet, is food the most important thing? Water the most important thing, right? What is it in that thing that matters the most? And why are those things important? And there isn't everything else, right? There's going to be just little details that you do throughout your stuff, but the main thing to understand is what's important to your stories, what's important to the universe, what's important there, that I need to understand, because it plays some pivotal role in the story. Like in The Mandalorian right now, if you guys are watching that, or if you guys know who Boba Fett is or whatever, he has his special armor, and that special armor really defines who he is, and that armor comes about and it's an importance and stuff in almost every episode, and different assets of his armor, and he gets the jetpack, and recently he got a spear, and Boba Fett showed up, and like all these things happened, all related to the armors and stuff. And so that's where the things can become either a MacGuffin, or things can be something where they become important, to the universe. And last but not least, is just understanding, how does this world become really interesting for you to play in? And we'll get into this a lot more, I think, in the next episode. I think this is a much bigger conversation. But in general, in our last 2 minutes, and please, if anybody has any last minute questions, please let me know, and I'll answer them, before we wrap up here. But if not, just in general, to understand the correlation between you're building your world, you're building these things, you're building the items, the bad guys, the enemies, the factions, and just everything that's in this world, right? And then in the end, it all has to kind of come together, right? It has to be like, okay, well, these guys live here, and these guys live here, and these guys might need to live here because they need this type of thing. Like the elves, in Lord of the Rings need the forest, and the forest is an integral part to who and how they are, right? It's not, you couldn't, the dwarves live underground, and they do that for a reason, and they're short for a reason, and they how they look, how they function, all those things is quite a factor of their environment and where they live in, right? And so that fits into the level designs and everything else that happens, right? And so, in human cities, build other things. And then, conflict could, make you have to put a wall around a city, right? Or you need lots of food, and so you have to have lots of farms, and you're building out these natural worlds that have to make sense. And so we'll get into that maybe next time, where we have to talk about what are these things that go into a world that make it understandable, make it, there to make it more realistic, so that the players can live in that world and experience the world and feel like it's a real living world. So anyways, once again, it's been a pleasure. I hope that everybody enjoyed this. Again, part 2 for world building. And again, a super deep topic, a huge, really, really, really complicated, conversation. And bear with me as we spend some weeks, going through and really trying to show you the best I can, like how do you make these things work, and I'm trying to just get beyond just theory and really try to get you guys to understand these things and actually really be able to use this knowledge. So Big Glob, thanks again as well. Thank you for joining every week. And Megan and everybody, I appreciate all your time. Blasphemer, thanks for talking. And everybody, again, be safe, especially, everything's locking down a lot more right now. I mean, I'm in California, Bay Area. I'm not leaving the house. So, hopefully you guys are all also being safe and being careful out there. And have a great week. And hopefully you're getting into starting to enjoy some of the holidays and stuff. So wish you all the best. And we'll see you all again next week for one more class before the holidays. And so thanks, Megan. And again, everybody, and have a great one. And we'll see some of you very soon and some of you next week. Take care and bye now.